This video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations. More on them later in the video.
The Arctic was once a zone free of geopolitical tension.
Arctic region is heating up.
The polar ice melts, northern nations are rushing.
Plentiful resources.
Russia has a very extensive threat perception in the region. This is
Moscow's military week building new bases.
The build-up of the Russian military bases.
When you think about geopolitically important regions, the Arctic isn't the first area that comes to mind. But over the last few years, the Arctic has slowly gotten more and more important. Russia and the NATO are now conducting huge military exercises in the region. In 2022 alone, 30,000 troops from NATO countries were training for war scenarios in northern Norway. Last year, the Scandinavian NATO members, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, have held multiple large-scale military exercises. To counter this, the Russian armed forces are also frequently doing military drills in the region. All because the North Pole has gotten more important in an economic sense. Countries like Russia, China are betting that Arctic will become a major trade hub in the future. So, this isolated region is catching the attention of world's biggest powers. And the reason is quite simple. At the center of Arctic lies the huge Arctic Ocean, which is 1.5 times the size of the United States. It connects the Pacific Ocean with the Atlantic Ocean. These waters were frozen just a few decades ago, but now they're slowly melting. The Arctic Ocean is now 3 degrees warmer than in 1980, and it is warming up 4 times faster than the rest of the world. Over the last 40 years, the ice caps in the Arctic have declined by 12.6% per decade on average. Especially during September, which is the month with the smallest Arctic ice caps, the decline is severe. According to NASA's data, the ice-covered area decreased from 6 to 7 million square kilometers in 1980 to only 3 to 4 square kilometers right now. Likely, this decline will only increase in the near future. When there's less ice in the Arctic, the area reflects less sunlight and absorbs more heat. This causes more ice to melt, which can lead to a vicious cycle. While this has bad effects for the environment, it also opens up some enormous opportunities. Economically speaking, resource deposits and trade routes worth trillions of dollars will become accessible. Trade from Asia to Europe and America could go through the Arctic Ocean, which will be incredibly fast as compared to the traditional routes. Right now, the Suez Canal and Panama Canals are essential for global trade. The Suez Canal connects Europe and Asia, and Panama Canal connects Asia with the eastern coast of America. But the sea routes through Arctic are 50% and 30% faster than these routes respectively. Now, this might sound a bit weird when you're used to seeing the traditional world map. In the standard rectangular map, the Arctic seems like a huge detour. But when we look at the globe from a North Pole perspective, things are a whole lot different. Suddenly, the Arctic Ocean becomes the ideal transit route for global trade. There are roughly 3 sea routes through the ocean. The Northwest Passage next to the US and Canada, the Northeast Passage next to Russia and Norway, and the Transpolar Shipping Route through the middle. The first 2 are already accessible in the summer months. The third one could become accessible in the middle of the century. But the trade routes aren't the only opportunities that arise because of melting ice caps. The Arctic holds some of the largest reserves of untapped natural resources in the world. It is not exactly known how many resources are hidden underneath the ice caps, but the value likely ranges in trillions of dollars. Putin has publicly said that Russia estimates the value of Arctic resources at $30 trillion, which would be higher than the American GDP. This all makes the Arctic incredibly valuable for the future, which is causing a power struggle between many nations. So, in this video, we'll take a deep dive into the increasingly important geopolitics of the Arctic Ocean. But before we dive into the video, I have a gift for you guys. So hit the like button below and let's talk about the gift. I'm sure you love geopolitics. After all, that's why you're watching this video. Same reason I think you guys would love today's sponsor, Conflict of Nations. It's a military-themed PvP strategy game where you choose a real country to lead in modern global warfare against other 128 players. You can use many different units to build up your army. Tanks, jets, nuclear submarines, whatever you need to engage in epic battles. Or you can build alliances all over the world. When you're watching these videos, you can think about geopolitics, and when you're not watching the videos, you can make sure your country in conflict of nations is a geopolitical leader in your world. My favorite feature is the fact that I can play this on PC and my phone. That means I'm always on it and staying ahead of my competition. Best of all, you can use the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days, so better hurry.
Deep into the Arctic Circle.
On September 18th, satellites observed that Arctic sea ice had reached its annual low. This year's sea ice minimum is effectively tied for the second lowest on record.
The annual rate of sea ice loss has more than tripled since the 1990s. In the Arctic, melting ice is raising geopolitical tensions, kickstarting a race for potentially priceless minerals, oil deposits, and shipping routes.
The fast-changing front lines between U.S. and Russia.
Are oil and ice a recipe for disaster?
The area of the Arctic is traditionally defined by the Arctic Circle, which is the 60-degree mark on the globe. It contains about 20 million square kilometers in land area, or more than 2 times the area of China. There are 8 countries in the region: Russia, Canada, the United States, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and Denmark. Denmark itself isn't in the circle, but the huge island of Greenland is part of its kingdom. Russia has by far the most territory in the region, as it stretches over 53% of Arctic Ocean's coastline. This is leading Russia to claim dominance over the region, as we'll go over later in the video. But before we dive into all the strategic calculation that nations like Russia, the United States, or even China are making, we first have to cover the basis of it all. As with many geopolitical issues, the core can be summed up in one phrase: it's the economy, stupid. This map shows all of the fields containing oil, gas, and other natural resources in the Arctic. A number of them are already being exploited, but there's also a huge number of potential fields that are not fully explored. The 2008 US Geological Survey thinks that there are 90 billion barrels of oil, 1,669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquids in the region. This would be 13% of world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its undiscovered natural gas. The exploitation of these resources is extremely costly, but with ice melting, this would become a feasible thing in the future. And even if fossil fuel consumption declines, the region's resources will still be crucial. There are huge deposits of rare earth metals in the Arctic, which are irreplaceable for electric cars, wind turbines, and solar panels. Alaska alone houses at least 150 deposits of these valuable metals. Greenland has some of the world's largest rare earth deposits, and Arctic also houses many other minerals. It already produces 40% of world's palladium, 20% of its diamonds, and 11% of its cobalt, just to name a few. There are also gold, iron ore, copper, and zinc. The full potential of Arctic's natural resources isn't even known yet, simply because it's not surveyed. Before, there was no interest in the Arctic's resources because they couldn't be accessed. But as the region warms up, a lot of the land and sea will melt, making it possible to mine the resources. This all begs the question, who owns what? The land borders are clearly defined, but that's not the case in the ocean. The Arctic Ocean is governed by the law of the sea, which is less straightforward than you would think. Every country has its own special economic zone, which stretches at least 200 nautical miles into the ocean according to the international law. However, it's still unsettled who owns what, as you can see on this map. Many borders between economic zones haven't been clearly defined yet. One of these situations is in the Beaufort Sea, between the United States and Canada. The US state of Alaska and the Canadian state of Yukon have overlapping claims there. This wouldn't be a big problem if it weren't for the huge oil and gas reserves in this sea. According to the Canadian National Energy Board, the territory contains 1.7 trillion cubic meters of gas and more than a trillion cubic meters of oil. So this dispute is a multi-trillion-dollar question. This little piece of land could sustain Canada's energy consumption for decades. And this isn't the only disagreement that the United States and Canada have in the Arctic. Canada claims that the Northwest Passage is part of its special economic zone, while the United States says it is an international waterway. This passage could be very important in the future because it can replace the Panama Canal as a route from Pacific to the Atlantic. In the past, the US has fought a war over the Panama Canal, so waterways like this are hugely important. Because of the relatively friendly relations between the two nations, the fighting will likely stay diplomatic, but that doesn't mean it will be easy. Talking about waterways, another contentious waterway is the Northeast Passage, a shipping route from Asia to Europe. This map shows that it can replace the traditional route going through the Malacca Strait, Bab al-Mandeb Strait, and the Suez Canal. The part of the Northeast Passage above the Siberian coast is called the Northern Sea Route, which Russia claims as its own. Although other countries don't agree with this, Russia thinks it has the right to control foreign ships passing by this route. This wasn't a big deal when the region was just a bunch of ice, but with the ice melting now, this trade route could become an important part of the global economy. So the fighting is picking up. Under the international law, the high seas of the Arctic Ocean are heritage of all mankind. But Russia has huge claims in the middle of the ocean, stretching all the way to the North Pole. It claims this ridge, which is a long piece of shallow seabed running right through the Arctic Ocean. To back up this claim, Russian divers even planted a flag at the bottom of the ocean. In all fairness, this is not an outrageous claim. Shallow parts of the sea can be claimed by a country with the landmass next to it. But the problem here is that it's not clear which country borders the ridge. Both Russia, Canada, and Denmark claim that it is part of their continental shelf, resulting in 3 overlapping claims. The United Nations is in charge of recognizing who owns what, and there are still legal battles going on about this issue. This is incredibly important for the nations because the country who owns the ridge has the right to exploit potential resources there. In the past, the issues like this have been resolved by splitting the area equally among the nations, but that can only happen if every nation agrees. A great example of this is Russia and Norway's claim over the Barents Sea. They had an overlapping claim the size of half of Germany, but they just decided to split the area in 2, resolving 40 years of diplomatic back and forth.
Perhaps the biggest step forward in the development of the Arctic. We can now say with certainty that Russia will expand into the Arctic in the next century.
And its nuclear-powered engines give it almost unlimited endurance. Russia has 2 other ships just like this one already, and 6 even larger icebreakers on the way.
Many countries are betting on the future of the Arctic, but Russia is the pioneer in this regard. This makes a lot of sense when you look at the numbers. It has about 5 million square kilometers of land and over 25,000 kilometers of coastline in the Arctic. While only 2.5 million people live in the Arctic Russia, it's still a hugely important region for the country. It makes up about 20% of Russia's GDP and 22% of its exports. This is because Russia has a resource-driven economy. Oil and gas make up about 16% of its GDP and 12 trillion rubles of the government budget in 2022. This was about 50% of total government revenue of 25 trillion rubles. So, natural resources are basically the financial lifeline of Moscow. Russia also has a huge mining industry producing goods like iron ore, gold, aluminum, and diamonds. In all of these products, Russia is one of the top producers in the world. Because this resource-driven business model has been such a success, Moscow is looking at ways to expand it. And the Arctic seems like the perfect place to do so. It has huge amounts of untapped resources that can be a growth opportunity for Russia's economy. That's why Moscow launched a 15-year development plan for the Arctic in 2019. First of all, Russia wants to make the Northern Sea Route operational. Putin issued a presidential decree in 2018 saying that the Northern Sea Route should become a global transport route. By 2030, the Russian authorities want to ship more than 100 million tons of cargo through the route. This is a very high target, but the growth is already exponential. Over the last decade, the cargo volume through the route has increased 15-fold as shown on this chart. In 2021, the total volume was 35 million tons, with a record 86 transit journeys. To continue this growth trajectory, Russia plans to build 40 nuclear icebreaker ships. On top of that, Russia is developing 3 Leader-class ships which can break up the ice for the commercial ships. It is also making 16 search and rescue ships that can help ships when they get stuck in ice. All of this will make commercial transit a whole lot easier. Apart from the ships, the Russian authorities are also building the necessary infrastructure like ports, railways, and oil and gas terminals. The most impressive infrastructure project has to be the 110 billion Vostok oil project. It's located on the coast of Taimyr Peninsula in Siberia, and it will be the largest Arctic oil terminal. The project led by the giant Rosneft company is the cornerstone of Russia's Arctic ambition. Eventually, the Vostok port could ship 100 million tons of oil per year. It will be highly profitable because there's an estimated 5 billion tons of oil reserves in the area. Going back to the natural resource map from earlier, we can see that the Taimyr Peninsula has one of the biggest onshore oil and gas fields in the region. The project also includes 2 airports, 15 industrial villages, and a 500-mile pipeline. For the construction alone, 400,000 workers will be needed. Over the long term, the project could create 130,000 jobs. According to the leader of Rosneft, it is the biggest oil project in the world. In a meeting with Putin, he claimed that this project alone could increase the GDP of Russia by 2% a year. Whether these figures are trustworthy or not, it's undoubtedly a huge part of Russia's economic planning. Another massive investment in Russia's Arctic region is the Yamal mega project, which Russia's gas company Novatek is the biggest shareholder of. The peninsula and its nearby areas contain 20.4 trillion cubic meters of natural gas and 1 billion tons of gas condensate and oil. The Yamal Peninsula is part of Yamalya region, which is the largest oil and gas producing part of Russia. According to Novatek, it contains 80% of Russia's gas supply and 15% of world's gas supply. Some people say that it's the crown jewel of the Northern Sea Route. Most of the natural gas comes from this field, where 115 billion cubic meters can be extracted every year. Much of this natural gas is liquefied and turned into LNG. Then it is shipped through the port of Siberia, constructed by Novatek and the Russian government. Along with this port, there is also an airport, a power plant, and a 300 miles railway providing access to gas field and the seaport. The project cost around $27 billion and it has a total capacity for 16.5 million tons of LNG per year. Right next to the Yamal Peninsula, Russia is starting up yet another LNG project in cooperation with the same company. On the Siberian Gaida Peninsula, it's investing $21 billion to fund the Arctic LNG 2 project. It has a capacity of 6.6 million tons of LNG per year. Most of it comes from the nearby field. Just like the Yamal project, it also includes an airport, a seaport, and a power plant. As if these massive LNG projects were not enough, Russia and Novatek are already planning a third one. It will be called the Murmansk LNG project, lying close to Norway on the Barents Sea. It will begin construction in 2024 after the Arctic LNG 2 project is finished. The huge push for LNG is part of Russia's strategy to achieve 20% market share in the global LNG market. The LNG from these plants will ship through the Northern Sea Route on large tankers. Russia is constructing 16 icebreaker gas tankers and 15 LNG icebreaker ships to transport the fossil fuels to the Arctic Sea.
The bear and the dragon are crawling together in the north. Moscow and Beijing have signed a deal.
中俄合作无上限， 我们争取和平无上限，维护安全无上限，反对霸权。
As the world is concerned about climate change and Arctic ice melt, there is one nation which of course is rejoicing in this rather worrying phenomenon. It happens to be
China, the world's biggest consumer and importer of energy, will turn on its taps for Russian gas next week. Now, an enormous new pipeline dubbed the Power of Siberia.
So, Russia is making huge plans for the exploitation of the Arctic. But after the February 2022 invasion, there seemed to be a huge problem. There were a lot of Western companies heavily invested in Russia's Arctic ambitions. The most prominent example of this was the French Total Energies company. It owns significant shares on the LNG projects in Siberia, which backfired after the Ukraine war started. Just a few months ago, Washington announced heavy sanctions on Russia's Arctic LNG projects. Now, Russian oil and gas cannot be sold to Western markets anymore. It's still unclear what Total Energies is going to do with these billions of dollars of investment. The sanctions also had a huge effect on Russia's own investment ambitions. Many Western companies were heavily involved in the development of oil and gas infrastructure. This includes companies like American General Electric, Baker Hughes, the German Lind, and the British Helen Smith. They left after the Ukraine invasion, which paused many of Russian projects. However, this doesn't seem to be the end of the story for Moscow. There was one country who stepped in to fill the void. Guess what that country was? It was China, of course. As Western investments and customers left, the Chinese bought huge shares of Arctic projects, supplied oil and gas technology to Russia, and secured enormous oil and gas supplies. The well-known Belt and Road Initiative even has a branch solely dedicated to this region, the Polar Silk Road. This project was started in 2018 to get China geopolitical influence in the Arctic. The Chinese government began to claim that it was a near-Arctic state, although the shortest distance between the country and the Arctic Circle is 900 miles. Despite this large distance, China still has two vital interests in the region: access to trade routes and access to resources. Let's start off with the sea routes to the Arctic. China is well known for being a trade nation, as it ranks first on the total international trade with $6.3 trillion of it in 2022. The melting of the ice caps will be a huge economic opportunity for China. The new routes through the Arctic can be shorter and way more profitable. Right now, shipping from Dalian in China to the biggest European port in Rotterdam takes 48 days through the Suez Canal, but it will only take 33 days through the Northern Sea Route. And this can also resolve some of the weakness in China's trade routes. 80% of China's trade to Europe goes through the Malacca Strait, as does 70% of China's oil imports. The whole Chinese economy is dependent on this single passage, which is only 1.5 nautical miles wide at its choke. If a conflict breaks out against a rival nation, this is one of the biggest Chinese weakness. So, China has been looking at ways to diversify this trade, which the Polar Silk Road can offer. It can replace the traditional routes from Asia to Europe, something that was proven in 2013. The Yangshan became the first Chinese cargo ship to cross the Northern Eastern Passage. To secure its commercial shipping through this passage in the future, Beijing is building an Arctic icebreaker fleet. It currently has 2 icebreakers, and it's building a third one already. Another important interest of China is to secure energy resources. The country is by far the largest energy consumer in the world. As you can see on this chart, China's primary energy consumption has exploded over the last years, taking over the US as the biggest in the world. China now uses 44 terawatt-hours a year, compared to US's 27 terawatt-hours. As the most energy-hungry nation on Earth, the potential new resources in the Arctic are of a particular concern to China. That's why China has gotten involved in Russia's energy projects in the far north. For example, the Yamal LNG project is partially owned by China. The state-owned China National Petroleum Corporation has a 20% stake, and the Silk Road Fund has a 9.9% stake of the project. The The Chinese government is also heavily invested in the new Arctic LNG project. The China National Offshore Oil Corporation and the China National Petroleum Corporation both have a 10% stake, and they are both state-owned. In total, China invested more than $90 billion in Russian Arctic projects. By doing this, it has secured energy resources long into the future. It's almost certain that the new Russian LNG tankers will be heading to China, especially because Western export markets have closed to Russia. As you can imagine, Putin is very happy with this helping hand from Beijing. In 2017, he said that the Silk Road has reached the north, welcoming the Chinese investment in Russia's energy projects. In Putin's recent visit to Beijing, this energy cooperation was one of the main topics. The Russian side is eager to replace its European export market with the growing Chinese one. Part of this plan is to build gas pipelines from Siberia to China. The first one has already been constructed, called the Power of Siberia pipeline. This pipeline stretches over 2,000 miles and connects various Siberian gas fields with northern China. In 2019, China and Russia signed a $400 billion deal for 30 years of gas supply through this pipeline. In 2022 alone, Power of Siberia supplied 15 billion cubic meters of gas to China. This is projected to reach 38 billion cubic meters by 2027. But this wasn't enough for Putin, as he aims to export 98 billion cubic meters of gas to China by 2030. That's why Russia proposed another huge national gas pipeline called Power of Siberia 2. This 6,000-mile pipeline would transport natural gas all the way from Arctic Yamal Peninsula to northern China via Mongolia. In this way, Russia could connect its Arctic gas reserves to Chinese export market. This would have a 50 billion cubic meter annual capacity, and it would cost only $14 billion. Russia is eager to start this project, as Putin called it the deal of the century. But there are some issues over the gas price and the feasibility of the pipeline. China doesn't want to pay a high price for Russian natural gas because there are cheaper alternatives. In general, China is not as desperate to buy natural gas as Russia is to sell it. On top of that, Chinese companies don't want to finance the pipeline, making it difficult for Russian companies to get started. In 2015, the project was postponed because of these issues. However, there is a chance that the pipeline starts construction despite these challenges. As Russia and China have started no-limits partnership, the strategic benefits of the pipeline could be more important than the economic feasibility. And a potential Power of Siberia 2 pipeline only strengthens China's position in the Arctic, as it could be a permanent connection with the Yamal Peninsula. Apart from all these deals with Russia, China has also tried to gain influence in other Arctic nations. For example, it invited Iceland to join the Belt and Road Initiative. It built a strategic railway between northern Norway and Finland, and it bought stakes in Greenland's rare earth mines. However, China receives a lot of pushback from the United States in these countries. Apart from Russia, all Arctic nations are US allies. Washington has been leveraging this to keep China out of the region as much as possible. An example of this is the fact that it pressured the Danish government, who's in charge of Greenland, to turn down deals from Beijing. Due to US security interests, Denmark refused an offer by a Chinese mining company to buy an abandoned naval base in Greenland. This could give China naval access to the Arctic, something that America doesn't like. Washington has also boycotted a deal between a Chinese construction company and the Greenlandish government to build 3 new airports. This brings us perfectly into the military activity that's been picking up in the region. According to former US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, the Arctic has become an arena for power and for competition. As the Arctic Ocean opened up to shipping routes and to resource exploitation, it has also opened up for military purposes. Just like any other ocean, the Arctic now has a lot of strategic importance. The biggest militaries in the world are waking up to this reality. But this is not the first time that Arctic was militarized. During the Cold War, the region was one of the frontiers. The fastest way to fly between the United States and Russia is over the North Pole. To defend against any incoming submarines and ballistic missiles, both nations built a large number of bases in the region. The US and Canada started a NORAD military organization to defend the continent against incoming Soviet attacks. In Greenland, the United States tried to build an underground military research station called Camp Century. Secretly, this was a cover-up for a tunnel system to house 600 nuclear warheads. Greenland is very close to the Soviet Union, which made it the perfect launching site. However, this project was not completed because of the shifting ice caps. Nonetheless, it just shows how strategically important the area was. After the Cold War ended though, most of the US and Soviet bases were abandoned. There was no strategic interest in the Arctic anymore. But over the last 2 decades or so, this has changed completely. Russia started to renovate hundreds of old Soviet bases, and it even built new ones in the region. Since 2014, it has built over 475 new military structures. It's not just Russia. United States is getting back in the region too. It's investing in bases in Greenland, and the NATO alliance is upgrading its military presence in the Arctic. But it seems like the Russian military is ahead. According to experts, the West's military footprint in the region lags behind at least 10 years to the Russian one. As you can see from this map, Russia operates way more military bases within the circle than all NATO members combined. In total, it outnumbers the alliance by a third. This is all going according to Moscow's plan. In Russia's 2022 Maritime Doctrine document, it says that the Arctic is its most important maritime direction. Russia will protect these waters by all means necessary. But the question is whether Russia's military presence in the region is solely for defensive purposes. Putin wants to re-establish Russia as a global power, and the Arctic seems like the perfect plan to start. Because the region is still underdeveloped, it's the wild, wild west, at least geopolitically speaking. And crucially, it's one of the few areas in the world where Russia has the chance to dominate the NATO alliance. Its northern fleet is the strongest navy in the area with 16 deep-water ports, 25 conventional and nuclear submarines, and 20 surface vessels. 8 of the submarines are capable of launching long-range nuclear missiles. Most of them are located on the Kola Peninsula, right next to Norway. Russia regularly exercises in the region, with a recent example being in January 2022. It launched a massive navy drills to secure its shipping lanes in the region. And Russia also has many bases along the Siberian coast, most notably its northernmost military base to date called their Trefoil base. It's located on the remote island here, and it houses a 35-meter runway and a Bastion coastal defense system. This airbase, just 500 miles south of the North Pole, gives Russian jets swift access to the whole region. Russia is also using the Arctic as a test bed for many of its new and novel weapon systems. It's testing many hypersonic missiles in the region, which are game-changing weapons that fly more than 5 times the speed of sound. They are extremely difficult to detect and are capable of hitting North America while avoiding its air defenses. One example of this is the Zircon cruise missile, which Russia successfully tested in 2022. These new weapons are being introduced to already powerful Northern Fleet. And the massive oil and gas investments that Russia is making in the Arctic are also an indirect military threat. Much of the infrastructure that is built for economic purposes is dual use, meaning that it can also be used by the Russian military. The air bases, railroads, and ports related to the existing infrastructure all also have military potential. These developments are concerning to NATO because it could lead Russia to control one of the most important oceans in the future. Another thing that's concerning NATO is the growing military cooperation between China and Russia, especially in the Arctic. Last August, a joint group of ships from the Russian and Chinese Navy were spotted near Alaska. 9 years ago, the same thing happened. When Obama visited Alaska in 2015, the Chinese Navy sent ships to the Bering Sea near the American coast. Apart from provocations like these, China and Russia are also training for combat situation in the region. During the 2022 military drills, Russia organized a major joint exercises with the Chinese military. This just shows that China also sees the Arctic as a place to compete with the United States. Along with the Ukraine war, this militarization of the Arctic has led Norway to increase its military alert level. A NATO member stated that it's the most serious security situation in decades. In part, this is because of the suspicious attack on Norway's subsea cable. This cable connects the Norwegian main island to the Arctic island that Norway controls. More than 2 miles of the cable were cut out, and Russia is #1 suspect. Although this provocation is nowhere near an act of war, tensions are definitely rising in Scandinavia. As a NATO member, Norway has the military backing of many Western countries. But to make sure they are able to respond in case of a war in Norway, NATO has ramped up its exercises in the region. The 2022 Cold Response exercise was the biggest in years. In 2023, the Norwegian Armed Forces led yet another massive exercise called Joint Viking. At the same time, the British held the Joint Warrior Naval exercise near the Norwegian coast. So, the NATO alliance is trying to prepare itself for the possible conflict in the region. The fact that Sweden and Finland also became NATO members helps a lot with this situation. They don't have access to the Arctic Ocean, but both nations have territory within the Arctic Circle. Their membership strengthens NATO's land and aerial presence in Scandinavia. During the 2024 Nordic Response exercise, Sweden and Finland will also participate. But Finland's membership in particular has a lot of strategic benefit for NATO. The country shares an 800-mile border with Russia, which partially goes through the Arctic. Combined with Norway's border, it makes for one of Russia's weak spots in the Arctic. Most of the northern fleet is located on the Kola Peninsula, which could be cut off during a NATO attack from Finland and Norway. Because the border is so large, it's very hard for Russia to defend this territory, and the consequences of Russia losing access to the Kola Peninsula would be huge. Without the Murmansk port, Russia could lose its dominance in the Arctic Ocean during a potential conflict. To bolster its other Arctic front, NATO is also stepping up its defenses along the North American coast. In 2022, NATO's Secretary General visited Canada's Arctic region for this purpose. One of the main talking points was upgrading the Cold War-era NORAD defense system. Canada and United States operate this together to protect against incoming Russian missiles and submarines. But this cooperation doesn't always work out well. The US spends way more on its defense than Canada. Its defense budget was 3% of the GDP in 2022, compared to Canada's 1.24%. Canada doesn't reach the 2% NATO spending standard, which America doesn't appreciate. Washington wanted to make upgrades to the NORAD system for years, but Canada had been slow to adapt. When Biden visited Ottawa last year, he talked about the lack of Canadian defense investments. However, this seems to have changed as Canada announced investment plans for its NORAD systems. It's going to invest $4.9 billion in its northern defenses over the next 6 years and $38 billion over the next 20 years. This includes modernizing the NORAD threat detection, improving air defenses, and building new military infrastructure in the north. However, this is peanuts when we compare to what the US is investing. In 2024, it plans to spend $145 billion on military innovation and modernization alone. This will improve America's capabilities in general, which will have benefits for NORAD defenses as well. It's also building military infrastructure in Alaska. Recently, the US military announced plans to expand its port in Nome to make it a deep-water port. After the new $600 million investment, this port will hold big US ships close to the Arctic Ocean. It also invested $300 million in an Alaskan air base. The US Air Force has transferred dozens of F-35s to the state, saying that it will host more advanced fighters than any other location in the world. The US is also expanding its presence in Greenland, where it has committed $4 billion to an airbase. But it remains to be seen if this is enough to counter the growing Arctic threat from Russia. The NATO alliance has to act fast because it's still at a disadvantage in numbers. Lastly, remember you can use the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Offer is only available for 30 days. Don't waste time. I'll see you guys in the game.